Are you trapped in an emotionally abusive medieval household? Living with a stepmother who somehow has enough free time to make your life miserable 24 hours a day? Have your sisters been calling you Ash Girl since breakfast? Do you smell faintly of fireplace? Well, don't improve yourself. Don't develop healthy coping skills. Just call Fairy Godmother Life Coaching. Our certified magical consultants have over 800 years of experience helping random peasants become royalty through absolutely unrealistic expectations. For just 1 pumpkin, 6 mice, 2 lizards, and your last shred of common sense, we'll provide 1 luxury carriage with 0 crash safety ratings, 4 horses that were rodents approximately 30 seconds ago, a dress worth more than your entire village, shoes designed by someone who clearly hated human feet, and enough glitter to permanently blind nearby nobles. But wait, there's more. Our patented Royal Husband Acquisition Program teaches important life skills like making dramatic entrances, leaving before explaining literally anything, running away instead of exchanging phone numbers, and communicating exclusively through footwear. Studies show 98% of princes are apparently incapable of recognizing the same woman unless she's wearing expensive shoes. Amazing. Who knew facial recognition was invented after monarchy? Side effects may include midnight panic attacks, pumpkin-related transportation issues, bird surveillance, jealous relatives, glass-related workplace injuries, and accidentally marrying into centuries of political instability. Not available in villages currently experiencing plague, Viking raids, dragon attacks, or tax collection. Fairy Godmother Life Coaching is not responsible for lost footwear, royal family drama, glass splinters, witches pretending to be career counselors, or explaining to your future children how grandma got eaten in the original folklore. Fairy Godmother Life Coaching. Because apparently therapy hadn't been invented yet. Disclaimer. The following documentary is intended for historical, educational, folkloric, literary, anthropological, psychological, and spiritually exhausting purposes only. This documentary discusses historical folklore, medieval legends, ancient mythology, ritual practices, and academic interpretations from multiple cultures. Some material remains debated among historians, folklorists, anthropologists, literary scholars, and at least one guy on the internet who's absolutely convinced Cinderella was secretly about aliens. Pizzaverse Studios does not encourage cutting off your toes to impress royalty, taking relationship advice from witches, accepting magical contracts without reading the fine print, eating mysterious food offered by forest spirits, assuming every elderly woman living in the woods is your fairy godmother, negotiating with ravens, blood sacrifices for social mobility, testing glass footwear after midnight, no pumpkins, mice, fairy godmothers, enchanted slippers, ravens, trolls, masasa, witches, or emotionally unstable princes were harmed during production. If your stepmother begins speaking in ancient riddles, you should probably leave. Viewer discretion is advised. Now let's get into it.
Cinderella. The bloody origins of the world's darkest fairy tale. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent D. Prio. Research based on publicly available historical, literary, and folkloric sources. For generations we've been told Cinderella is a story about kindness rewarded. A lonely girl. A cruel stepmother. A fairy godmother. A glass slipper. And happily ever after. But that's not the story Europe originally told. Before Disney. Before Charles Perrault. Before the Brothers Grimm. There existed darker versions. Stories filled with murder. Cannibalism. Blood. Foot mutilation. Ancient magic. And transformation so violent that the original heroine barely survives becoming the princess. Today we're digging through nearly 2,000 years of folklore to uncover the real history hiding beneath one of the world's most beloved fairy tales. This is Cinderella before the cleaning crew showed up. The fairy tale before fairy godmothers. When someone says the word Cinderella, almost everyone pictures the same story. A lonely servant girl. A cruel stepmother. A fairy godmother waving a magic wand. A pumpkin turning into a carriage. Glass slippers. A prince. And a happily ever after. It's become one of the most recognizable stories on Earth. Disney made it magical. Children's books made it comforting. Hollywood made it romantic. But almost none of that existed in the oldest versions. In fact, if you walked into a medieval village and asked someone to tell you the story of Cinderella, there's a good chance you wouldn't recognize what came next. There might not be a fairy godmother. There might not be a pumpkin. There might not even be glass slippers. Instead, you might hear about murder, cannibalism, blood sacrifice, tree spirits, talking birds, foot mutilation, or supernatural beings demanding payment for every gift they gave. The story wasn't designed to comfort children. It was designed to explain something adults already understood. Life wasn't fair. Power wasn't free. And transformation always came with a price. To understand why Cinderella became one of history's most enduring stories, we first have to forget almost everything modern culture taught us about it. The version most people know today is only a few hundred years old. The roots of the story stretch back far beyond that. Long before Disney. Long before the Brothers Grimm. Long before Charles Perrault transformed it into elegant French literature. Long before Giambattista Basile wrote the first literary version in 17th century Naples. The story already existed. Not as a book, not as a poem, but as something much older. An oral tradition. Stories carried from village to village. From grandmother to granddaughter. From traveling merchants. From shepherds. From farmers. From people who couldn't read, but never forgot. Every generation changed the story slightly. Every region added its own fears, its own customs, its own monsters, its own understanding of justice. The result wasn't one Cinderella. It was hundreds. Some scholars estimate there are well over 500 recorded variants spread across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Some are gentle. Others are absolutely horrifying. What's fascinating isn't how different they are. It's how many of the same ideas refuse to disappear. A young woman trapped at the bottom of society. Cruel family members. Supernatural intervention. A test of identity. Transformation. Recognition. A new life. Those building blocks remain almost everywhere. Everything else changes. That raises an interesting question. If so many cultures created their own Cinderella, where did the story actually begin? Unfortunately, nobody knows for certain. Unlike historical events, fairy tales rarely leave birth certificates. They evolve. They absorb new beliefs. They survive by changing just enough to remain recognizable while adapting to completely different societies. That's exactly what Cinderella did. Historians, folklorists, anthropologists, literary scholars have spent generations debating where the oldest version originated. Some point toward ancient Greece. Others argue China preserved one of the earliest surviving written forms. Many believe prehistoric European oral traditions already contained recognizable Cinderella elements thousands of years before anyone ever wrote them down. The truth may be all of the above. Stories travel. People migrate. Cultures borrow from one another. Ideas survive because they're useful, not because they're original. What matters isn't identifying a single creator. It's understanding why nearly every civilization kept retelling the same basic story. The answer may be surprisingly simple. Almost everyone has dreamed of becoming someone else. A servant becoming royalty. The forgotten becoming admired. The powerless becoming powerful. Transformation isn't just magical. It's deeply human. But ancient storytellers understood something modern adaptations often avoid. Transformation isn't free. You don't simply wake up wearing a beautiful dress. You pay. Sometimes emotionally. Sometimes physically. Sometimes spiritually. And sometimes with blood. That darker understanding echoes through nearly every early European version we'll explore today. The magical helper is rarely generous. The supernatural almost always expects something in return. The heroine rarely escapes unchanged. And justice looks very different than it does in modern fairy tales. Today, villains usually learn a lesson. In older folklore, villains often lose eyes, lose feet, lose their lives, or worse. These weren't stories about kindness. They were stories about consequences. The medieval world was violent. Disease was everywhere. Child mortality was common. War could arrive without warning. Marriage wasn't always romance. Often, it was economics, politics, or survival. Against that backdrop, Cinderella wasn't fantasy. It was hope wrapped inside brutality. A reminder that even someone born with nothing might still escape. But only if they endured enough suffering first. As strange as that sounds today, it made perfect sense to audiences living through famine, plague, political instability, and constant uncertainty. Their fairy tales reflected the world they knew, not the world they wished existed. We're going to peel away centuries of polishing. We'll uncover stories that literary editors tried to soften, publishers tried to sanitize, and filmmakers quietly ignored. By the time we're finished, you may never look at Cinderella the same way again. Because beneath every sparkling castle, every dancing princess, and every glass slipper lies one of the oldest and darkest stories Europe ever told, and this is only the beginning. Prehistoric Europe, survival, and the first Cinderellas. To understand where Cinderella truly begins, we have to travel back to a time before castles, before kingdoms, before Christianity, before written history itself. A time when stories weren't written down. They were remembered. Long before Europe was divided into nations, communities relied almost entirely on oral tradition. Stories weren't simply entertainment. They preserved knowledge. They explained danger. They warned people about the unknown. They carried history from one generation to the next. In societies where very few people could read, or where writing didn't exist at all, a forgotten story could mean a forgotten lesson. That made storytelling a matter of survival. Modern audiences often imagine prehistoric people as primitive. The archaeological record paints a very different picture. These were people who understood seasons, migration, astronomy, animal behavior, medicinal plants, and the rhythms of life in ways most modern people never will. Their world was unpredictable. Winter could kill entire communities. Disease arrived without warning. Food disappeared overnight. Children didn't always survive infancy. Death wasn't hidden away. It lived beside you every day. In that environment, transformation meant something very different than it does today. It wasn't about finding yourself. It was about surviving long enough to become someone new. Many folklorists believe the oldest Cinderella traditions may preserve fragments of initiation stories. Stories marking the transition from childhood into adulthood. Across prehistoric Europe, young people often underwent rituals designed to symbolize death and rebirth. Not literal death, but symbolic transformation. The child disappeared. The adult emerged. That theme sits at the very heart of Cinderella. A girl loses everything. She enters a period of suffering. She descends into isolation. She endures impossible trials. Then she emerges transformed. Whether those rituals actually inspired Cinderella remains debated among scholars. But the similarities are difficult to ignore. The ashes themselves may hold another clue. Across numerous European cultures, ash symbolized more than dirt. It represented endings, purification, death, and renewal. Fire destroyed, but it also created. Ash marked what remained after transformation. Even Cinderella's name reflects that symbolism. Ash Girl, Ash Maiden, Aschenputtel, Cenerentola, Cendrillon. Again and again, versions of the story identify the heroine with ashes. Not because she's dirty, because she occupies the symbolic space between destruction and rebirth. She has already lost her old life. She simply hasn't entered the new one yet. That symbolism appears across cultures separated by centuries. Different languages, different religions, different kingdoms. Yet the ashes remain. Some anthropologists have suggested that ancient versions may have involved ancestor worship. In many early European belief systems, the dead remained active members of the family. Ancestors protected descendants, guided them, warned them, sometimes intervened directly. That idea survives surprisingly well inside Cinderella. The magical helper often isn't a random fairy. Sometimes it's the spirit of the heroine's mother. Sometimes it lives inside a tree. Sometimes it appears as a bird. Sometimes as an animal. Sometimes as an unseen supernatural force. The form changes. The purpose doesn't. The dead continue helping the living. That relationship would have made perfect sense to prehistoric audiences. The boundary between life and death wasn't viewed the same way modern society often sees it. The dead remained present, watching, protecting, judging. Even the famous tree growing from a mother's grave, found in later European versions, may preserve echoes of beliefs thousands of years older than the written stories themselves. Trees connected heaven, earth, and the underworld. Their roots reached into death. Their branches stretched towards the sky. They became natural symbols of transformation. Another recurring pattern appears throughout ancient folklore, the idea that gaining power always demands sacrifice. Modern fairy tales often separate magic from consequences. Older stories rarely do. Every gift carries a cost. Every blessing creates obligation. Every transformation requires payment. That principle existed throughout ancient Europe. It appears in Celtic mythology, Germanic traditions, Slavic folklore, Greek mythology, Norse legends. Power wasn't free, neither was knowledge, neither was beauty, neither was survival. Everything demanded exchange. That worldview shaped nearly every version of Cinderella that followed: the magical dress, the supernatural shoes, the royal marriage. None of them arrive without hidden consequences. As we continue through the centuries, you'll notice something remarkable. Authors changed names, they changed locations, they softened violence, they invented fairy godmothers, they added pumpkins, they removed older religious symbolism. But one thing almost never disappeared. Transformation always demanded sacrifice. Perhaps that's why the story survived, not because people believed magic was real, but because they recognized the emotional truth beneath it. Real change hurts. Real growth requires letting something go. Real transformation often feels like losing the person you used to be. Ancient storytellers understood that long before modern psychology gave it a name. The earliest Cinderellas weren't promising miracles. They were preparing listeners for reality. Life would break you. Loss was inevitable. Family could betray you. Society wasn't fair. But if you endured, if you adapted, if you survived, you might become someone stronger than the person who entered the fire. That lesson proved timeless. And it carried Cinderella across thousands of years, waiting for the first writer brave enough to finally put the story on paper. That writer would be an Italian court poet living beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. His name was Giambattista Basile. Giambattista Basile and the first literary Cinderella. By the early 1600s, Europe was changing. Empires expanded. Trade routes connected distant kingdoms. The Renaissance had transformed art and literature. But beneath the elegance of Europe's royal courts, old superstitions refused to die. No city embodied that contradiction better than Naples. 17th century Naples was one of the largest cities in Europe. It was beautiful, wealthy, dangerous. Noble families competed for influence. Political conspiracies unfolded behind palace walls. Religious devotion existed alongside ancient folk magic. Volcanic Mount Vesuvius loomed over everything, a constant reminder that nature could erase civilization without warning. It was here that a court official named Giambattista Basile accomplished something no one had done before. He wrote Cinderella down. Not the version most people know today. The original literary version. Published after his death in 1634 as part of Lo Conto degli Conti, also known as The Tale of Tales, Basile's story was called La Gatta Cenerentola, the Cat Cinderella. And it wasn't written for children. It was written for adults. Adults who understood betrayal, power, politics, and the uncomfortable reality that sometimes survival required making impossible choices. Unlike the passive heroine that would appear in later adaptations, Basile's Cinderella is named Zezolla. She doesn't spend the story waiting to be rescued. She changes the course of her own life. At the beginning of the tale, Zezolla lives under the authority of a cruel stepmother. Seeing her misery, Zezolla's governess offers shocking advice. Instead of enduring the abuse, remove the problem. The governess convinces Zezolla that if the stepmother were gone, life would improve. One day, while the woman leans over a large chest, Zezolla slams the heavy lid onto her neck. The stepmother dies. For modern audiences, it's a startling moment. The future Cinderella commits homicide before the story has barely begun. But Basile wasn't trying to create a perfect heroine. He was writing about consequences. And consequences arrive almost immediately. The governess marries Zezolla's father. Instead of becoming a loving parent, she proves even worse. She brings 6 daughters into the household. Each receives expensive clothing, fine food, comfort. Zezolla receives ashes, hard labor, and humiliation. The woman she trusted becomes the architect of her suffering. It's one of the earliest examples of a lesson repeated throughout Basile's work. Power changes people. Promises are cheap, and shortcuts often create even greater disasters. Unlike modern versions, Basile never suggests life is divided into good people and bad people. Everyone exists somewhere in the gray. Heroes make terrible decisions. Villains occasionally tell the truth. Fortune changes constantly. That uncertainty reflects the world Basile actually lived in. Naples wasn't a kingdom where justice always prevailed. Politics rewarded manipulation. Noble families betrayed one another. Alliances shifted overnight. The Cinderella story mirrored that reality. Eventually, Zazola's father leaves on a voyage. Before departing, he asks whether she wants a gift. She doesn't ask for jewelry, or money, or beautiful dresses. Instead, she requests a very specific object from the island of Sardinia. A date branch. A simple request. One that changes everything. Her father forgets. Only after supernatural forces interrupt his journey does he remember his promise. He returns with the branch. Zazola plants it. From the earth grows a magnificent date tree unlike anything in nature. This tree becomes the heart of Basile's story. Later fairy tales would replace it with a fairy godmother. But Basile's magic grows from grief itself. The tree rises from memory, from loss, from promises kept, and from the lingering presence of the dead. Whenever Zazola approaches the tree with respect, miraculous things begin to happen. Beautiful clothing appears. Jewels emerge. Magnificent garments beyond imagination become available to her. There are no magic wands, no sparkling dust, no cheerful songs. Only ancient magic rooted in nature. The tree functions almost like a living ancestor, watching, protecting, responding. It reflects older European beliefs that the dead remained connected to the living through sacred places and natural objects. The royal celebration arrives. Zazola secretly attends. Not once, but repeatedly. Each appearance leaves the court astonished. No one knows who the mysterious young noblewoman truly is. The king's son becomes captivated. She arrives. She dazzles everyone. Then she disappears before anyone can learn her identity. Sound familiar? Many elements of the modern Cinderella are already here. The hidden identity. The mysterious beauty. The royal celebration. The lost slipper. But Basile's tone remains entirely different. This isn't romance. It's strategy. Every appearance is calculated. Every entrance perfectly timed. Every exit carefully planned. Eventually, as she flees the celebration, one of her elegant shoes slips from her foot. The prince orders a search across the kingdom. House after house. Village after village. The mysterious owner must be found. When the shoe finally reaches Zazola, it fits perfectly. Her identity is revealed. She marries the prince. Her abusive family loses everything they spent years trying to control. Justice arrives. But not because kindness magically defeated evil. Justice comes because intelligence, patience, opportunity, and a little supernatural intervention finally aligned. Basile's ending lacks the sentimental forgiveness later versions would embrace. There is no emotional reconciliation, no group hug, no heartfelt apology. The guilty simply lose. The heroine wins, and life moves forward. Looking back nearly 4 centuries later, Basile's Cinderella feels surprisingly modern. Not because of the magic, but because of its honesty. People make terrible choices. Families betray one another. Power corrupts. Hope survives. Transformation remains possible. But no one reaches the palace without carrying scars. Basile preserved one of Europe's oldest stories just before countless oral traditions disappeared forever. Without his work, much of what came before might have vanished into history. Yet his version wouldn't become the world's Cinderella. That honor belonged to a French author writing 60 years later. A man who would remove much of the blood. Replace ancient tree spirits with elegant fairy godmothers. Exchange raw survival for polished court etiquette. And unknowingly create one of the most influential fairy tales ever written. His name was Charles Perrault. Charles Perrault, Versailles, and the fairy godmother. If Giambattista Basile gave Europe its first written Cinderella, Charles Perrault gave the world the version it would never forget. To understand why his story became so influential, you first have to understand where he lived. Late 17th century France wasn't simply a kingdom, it was the center of European power. At the heart of it all stood the Palace of Versailles. Built by King Louis XIV, the self-proclaimed Sun King, Versailles wasn't just a royal residence. It was a carefully designed machine. Every hallway, every garden, every ceremony, every conversation was part of an elaborate performance of power. Nobles competed constantly for status. The right invitation. The right clothing. The right marriage. One mistake could destroy decades of influence. Appearances meant everything. Charles Perrault understood that world better than most. Born in 1628, Perrault served inside the French government and spent years among the political elite. He knew how court life worked. He understood ambition. He understood image. And perhaps more importantly, he understood public relations centuries before anyone used those words. When he published Histoire ou Contes du temps passé in 1697, later known simply as Mother Goose Tales, he wasn't merely preserving old folklore. He was reshaping it. His Cinderella wasn't written for medieval peasants. It was written for aristocratic society. Violence became elegance. Brutality became refinement. Ancient superstition became polished fantasy. Gone was Basile's murderous heroine. Gone were the darker religious undertones. Gone were many of the uncomfortable moral ambiguities. In their place appeared a young woman whose greatest strength wasn't cunning. It was grace. Patience. And dignity. Perrault's Cinderella suffers quietly. She doesn't seek revenge. She doesn't manipulate events. She waits. At first glance, it seems like a completely different story. But beneath the polished surface, many older ideas remain, only now they're hidden behind beauty. Perrault also introduced perhaps the most famous character in fairy tale history, the fairy godmother. Before Perrault, magical helpers often appeared as ancestral spirits, sacred trees, birds, or mysterious supernatural forces connected to older European traditions. The fairy godmother changed everything. She transformed ancient folklore into something audiences immediately understood. Warm, comforting, protective. Instead of terrifying supernatural beings demanding impossible bargains, magic became friendly, predictable, hopeful. Perrault also introduced another element that has become inseparable from Cinderella: midnight. The magic ends at 12. Today it feels obvious, but that deadline barely exists in earlier versions. Why midnight? Perhaps because it represents transition. One day ending, another beginning. Reality replacing illusion. Or perhaps because every fantasy needs limits. Without limits, magic stops being meaningful. The clock reminds both Cinderella and the audience that borrowed miracles never last forever. Time always catches up. Interestingly, Perrault's prince remains surprisingly passive. Unlike later Disney adaptations, he spends relatively little time developing a romance. His fascination is immediate, almost mysterious. The story isn't really about falling in love. It's about recognition. Finding someone extraordinary hidden beneath ordinary circumstances. Perhaps Perrault understood that appearance often concealed reality. After all, Versailles itself operated that way. Behind powdered wigs, expensive perfumes, lavish gowns, and elegant dances lurked ruthless political competition. Everyone performed a role. Everyone wore masks. Then came the transformation scene, one of the most recognizable moments in literature. A pumpkin becomes a magnificent coach. Mice transform into horses. A rat becomes the coachman. Lizards become elegant footmen. Rags become a dazzling silver gown. And finally, glass slippers. Those slippers would become one of the most famous objects ever created in fiction. Yet historians have debated them for centuries. Some scholars have argued Perrault may have intended slippers made of squirrel fur, not glass, based on similarities between old French words. Most modern researchers reject that theory. Perrault almost certainly meant glass. Why? Because glass represented luxury, fragility, beauty, transparency. It was expensive, rare, almost impossible to fake. Exactly the kind of object that symbolized aristocratic perfection. Unlike leather, glass couldn't stretch. It couldn't hide flaws. Either you fit, or you didn't. It became the perfect symbol for identity itself. One person, one slipper, one destiny. Everyone carefully constructed an image. Cinderella simply became the greatest performer of them all. Then comes one of Perrault's biggest departures from older traditions: forgiveness. When Cinderella becomes princess, she doesn't punish her stepsisters. She embraces them. She forgives them. She even arranges advantageous marriages for both of them. Modern audiences often see this as kindness. Some literary historians see something else: power. Think about it. The stepsisters spent years humiliating Cinderella. Now, their future depends entirely on her generosity. She no longer needs revenge. She has something far more valuable: control. It's one of the most sophisticated endings in fairy tale history. Mercy becomes the ultimate display of authority. Perrault also adds explicit moral lessons at the end of his story. Beauty helps. Grace matters. Good manners open doors. Kindness creates opportunities. These lessons reflected the values of Louis XIV's France. Court etiquette mattered. Appearance mattered. Behavior mattered. Perrault wasn't simply entertaining children. He was teaching readers how society believed successful people should behave. His version spread rapidly throughout Europe. Translations appeared. Publishers embraced it. Families passed it down for generations. Eventually, it became the Cinderella, the version against which nearly every later adaptation would be measured. But one group of scholars wasn't entirely satisfied. More than a century later, two German brothers traveled from village to village collecting older stories before they disappeared forever. They admired Perrault's work, but they believed something important had been lost. Too much elegance. Too much refinement. Too little justice. They decided to bring back the darkness, the blood, the birds, the violence, and some of the most unforgettable scenes ever placed inside a fairy tale. Their names were Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm, blood and divine justice. By the early 19th century, Europe was changing once again. The French Revolution had shaken monarchies. Napoleon had marched across the continent. Ancient traditions were disappearing. Industrialization was transforming villages into cities. And two German brothers feared something priceless was being lost forever. Not kingdoms. Not castles. Stories. Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm weren't originally trying to entertain children. They were scholars, linguists, collectors of folklore. They believed Germany's oldest stories preserved pieces of its cultural identity, fragments of a world that had existed long before written history. So they traveled. They interviewed villagers, farmers, servants, tradesmen, women who had learned old stories from their grandmothers. men who remembered legends passed down around winter fires. The result was published in 1812 as Children's and Household Tales. Despite the title, many of the stories weren't meant for children at all. They were strange, violent, sometimes terrifying. And their version of Cinderella, Aschenputtel, was no exception. If Perrault polished Cinderella into crystal, the Grimms buried her back in the ashes. The story begins not with a fairy godmother, but with death. Before Cinderella's mother dies, she gives her daughter one final instruction: remain good. Remain faithful, and I'll always watch over you. After her mother's death, Cinderella visits the grave every day. She cries. She prays. She mourns. Eventually, her father plants a hazel tree beside the grave. The tree grows. Birds begin nesting in its branches. Whenever Cinderella needs help, she goes to the tree. Not a fairy. Not a magical stranger. Her mother's spirit. Still watching. Still protecting. The tree grants dresses, jewelry, everything she needs. This version feels much older than Perrault's. Nature itself becomes sacred. The dead never truly leave. Ancient beliefs quietly survive beneath Christian imagery. Then comes one of the biggest differences. Instead of attending one royal celebration, Aschenputtel attends 3. For 3 consecutive nights, she appears in increasingly magnificent clothing. Each evening, she captivates the prince. Each evening, she disappears before he can discover her identity. By the 3rd night, the prince has had enough. Determined not to lose her again, he orders the palace staircase covered with pitch. As Cinderella flees, one golden slipper becomes stuck. Unlike Perrault's famous glass slipper, the Grimms originally described the shoe as golden, rich, royal, almost sacred. The prince announces that he will marry the woman whose foot fits the slipper. Then begins one of the darkest scenes in all of fairy tale history. The eldest stepsister desperately wants the throne. Her mother looks at her foot, then quietly hands her a knife. She gives simple instructions. Cut off your toe. Once you're queen, you'll never have to walk again. Without hesitation, the girl slices off part of her own foot. She forces it into the slipper. The prince believes she's the mysterious maiden. He places her on his horse. Together they ride away. But as they pass Cinderella's mother's grave, 2 white doves call out from the tree. Turn around, look again. There's blood inside the shoe. The shoe is much too small. The true bride still waits for you. The prince looks down. Blood pours from the golden slipper. The deception is exposed. He returns. The second sister tries. Her heel is too large. Again. The knife appears. Again. The mother encourages mutilation. Cut off your heel. You'll be queen. You won't need to walk anymore. She obeys. The slipper fits. Temporarily. The prince rides away once more. Again the birds speak. Again the blood betrays the lie. Again the prince turns back. Only then does Cinderella quietly step forward. She washes the ashes from her face. She places her foot inside the slipper. It fits perfectly. Without blood. Without force. Without deception. The birds descend from the tree. They perch gently on her shoulders. The prince finally recognizes the woman he'd been searching for. But the Grimm brothers weren't finished. Modern versions usually end with the wedding. Their version begins something even darker. During Cinderella's marriage ceremony, the two sisters attend, perhaps hoping for forgiveness, perhaps hoping to preserve whatever social standing they have left. Instead, the same white doves return. As the procession begins, one bird attacks the first sister. Another attacks the second. Each pecks out one eye. The ceremony continues. When the wedding ends, the birds strike again, removing the remaining eyes. The sisters spend the rest of their lives blind. Not because Cinderella demanded revenge, because divine justice had arrived. To modern audiences, the punishment feels shocking, cruel, excessive. But medieval audiences saw it differently. Justice wasn't always gentle. It wasn't therapeutic. It wasn't restorative. Justice restored balance. The sisters lied, mutilated themselves, attempted to deceive the prince, mocked innocence. Their punishment reflected the seriousness of those crimes. Throughout European folklore, birds often act as messengers between heaven and earth. The doves aren't random animals. They're agents of moral order, watching, judging, acting when humans fail. It's another reminder that Cinderella was never just a love story. It was a story about justice, about truth eventually revealing itself, about deception carrying consequences. The Grimms believed fairy tales preserved moral structure. Goodness wasn't rewarded because the universe was kind. Goodness was rewarded because order had to be restored. Their version also reminds us that transformation isn't merely external. The stepsisters try changing their bodies. Cinderella changes her character. Only one transformation succeeds. That contrast may explain why the Grimm version continues resonating more than 200 years later. It refuses to promise easy miracles. Instead, it suggests something much older. That appearances can deceive. That truth eventually emerges. And that no amount of blood spilled trying to become someone else can replace genuine identity. The brothers Grimm believed they were preserving Germany's ancient folklore. Instead, they helped preserve one of the darkest versions of Cinderella ever printed. But even the Grimms weren't telling the oldest stories. Across the Irish countryside, far from royal courts and palace balls, another Cinderella waited. One where fairy godmothers didn't grant wishes. They negotiated contracts, and every magical favor came with a debt. The Celtic otherworld, Irish variants, and fairy bargains. If the brothers Grimm believed justice came from heaven, the Irish believed it came from somewhere else entirely. Not above, not below, but beside us, just beyond the edge of the visible world. For thousands of years, Ireland preserved one of Europe's richest supernatural traditions. A landscape where every hill, every ancient tree, every standing stone, and every mist-covered valley might conceal an entrance to the other world. This wasn't fantasy to medieval Ireland. It was reality. The fairy folk the Owls see were not tiny winged creatures sprinkling glitter over flowers. They were ancient beings, older than kingdoms, older than Christianity, older, according to some traditions, than humanity itself. They were beautiful, dangerous, powerful, and absolutely unpredictable. To encounter one was considered both an extraordinary blessing and a terrifying risk. Unlike later fairy godmothers, these beings rarely gave gifts freely. Everything was an exchange. Every favor carried a price. Every promise became a contract. Every miracle created a debt. That idea appears throughout Irish Cinderella traditions. The heroine doesn't simply receive magical assistance. She enters into a relationship with supernatural forces that expect something in return. Sometimes it's loyalty, sometimes obedience, sometimes silence, sometimes promises that extend beyond her own lifetime. Irish folklore is filled with warnings about making bargains with the other world. Accept a gift, and you've accepted an obligation. Break that obligation, and consequences may follow your family for generations. That's a very different understanding of magic than modern audiences are used to. Today, fairy tales often present magic as convenience. In Celtic tradition, magic was responsibility. The Irish Cinderella often begins much like other European versions. A young woman loses her mother. A new family enters the household. Cruelty follows. But unlike many continental stories, her suffering prepares her for something greater than marriage. It prepares her for contact with the supernatural. In Celtic belief, hardship often transformed people. Pain stripped away illusion. Loss created wisdom. Isolation sharpened perception. Only those who endured enough suffering could safely navigate the boundary separating the human world from the other world. Many Irish stories describe sacred locations where that boundary became especially thin. Ancient burial mounds, stone circles, holy wells, lonely forests, crossroads, places where time behaved strangely. A single evening among the fairy folk might equal years in the human world. Food offered by supernatural beings could bind a person forever. Music could erase memory. Beauty itself became dangerous. Irish storytellers repeatedly warned listeners about appearances. The most beautiful stranger might be the most dangerous creature imaginable. The poorest traveler might secretly be one of the Owls. Nothing was exactly what it seemed. That uncertainty shapes the Irish Cinderella. When supernatural help finally arrives, the heroine never assumes she's safe. She behaves carefully, respectfully. She follows instructions precisely. She understands that one careless mistake could destroy everything. The clothing she receives isn't merely beautiful. It's enchanted. The garments recognize truth. The jewelry carries protective power. Even the shoes possess an awareness of their own. Everything connected to the other world remains alive in some sense. The prince himself becomes part of something larger. In Irish tradition, kings weren't simply political leaders. Their health reflected the health of the land itself. A worthy queen wasn't chosen only for beauty. She became partner in maintaining balance between humanity and the natural world. Marriage carried spiritual significance. Choosing the wrong queen threatened more than a royal family. It threatened the kingdom. Suddenly, the search for Cinderella isn't simply romantic. It's sacred. Whoever wears the magical shoe correctly has already been recognized by forces beyond ordinary human understanding. That recognition matters more than wealth, more than birth, more than appearance. Irish folklore repeatedly emphasizes another fascinating idea. Transformation never completely erases the past. The heroine becomes queen, but she remains connected to the supernatural beings who helped her. The debt continues. The relationship continues. The boundary between worlds never closes entirely. Many later Irish legends describe royal families believed to possess fairy ancestry. Children born with extraordinary gifts, unusual beauty, exceptional intelligence, or mysterious abilities. Whether anyone truly believed these stories almost doesn't matter. They reveal something important. Ancient Irish audiences saw transformation as permanent. You didn't borrow magic. You became part of it. That's one reason fairy bargains inspired such fear. They changed more than circumstances. They changed identity. Perhaps that's why Irish storytellers rarely describe fairy encounters as completely happy. Victory always carried uncertainty. Success always demanded vigilance. The happiest endings still required remembering promises made long ago. Modern versions of Cinderella often conclude with a wedding. Irish versions suggest the wedding is only the beginning, because living with the consequences of transformation proves far more difficult than achieving it. That uniquely Celtic understanding gives Cinderella an entirely different emotional weight. The goal isn't escaping hardship. The goal is surviving the price of success. It's an idea that echoes across nearly every ancient Irish legend. Nothing powerful comes without obligation. Nothing magical comes without sacrifice. And no bargain is ever truly free. As Christianity spread across Europe, many of these older beliefs slowly faded. But farther north, among snow-covered mountains, frozen fjords, and endless winter nights, another version of Cinderella emerged. One shaped not by fairy kingdoms, but by ice, storms, and gods who ruled the frozen edge of the world. The Scandinavian Ice Queens, Norse variants, and the price of winter. If Ireland imagined magic hidden beneath green hills, Scandinavia found it buried beneath snow. For much of the year, medieval Scandinavia existed in a world dominated by darkness. Long winters, frozen seas, towering mountains, forests that seemed to stretch forever. Entire communities depended upon surviving a single brutal season. Winter wasn't simply weather. It was an enemy. In that world, transformation meant survival. And survival demanded resilience. The Cinderella traditions that emerged across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland reflected that reality. They weren't stories about escaping chores. They were stories about enduring impossible conditions without losing hope. One of the best-known Scandinavian Cinderella tales is Katie Woodencloak, recorded in Norway during the 19th century, but preserving much older oral traditions. Unlike Perrault's polished French heroine, Katie's suffering begins with violence. After her mother dies, her father remarries. The new queen doesn't simply dislike Katie. She wants her erased. Using magic and deception, the queen forces Katie to wear a cloak made of rough wood. Heavy. Ugly. Uncomfortable. The disguise strips away her beauty and her identity. To everyone around her, she becomes invisible. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Powerful people often decide who gets seen and who disappears. Katie survives not because someone rescues her, but because she refuses to surrender who she is beneath the disguise. That theme echoes throughout Scandinavian folklore. Identity survives beneath hardship. Winter may cover the earth with ice, but spring eventually returns. Nature itself becomes a metaphor for endurance. Unlike warmer parts of Europe, Scandinavian stories often portray magical helpers as ancient women connected to the wilderness. Sometimes they resemble forgotten goddesses. Sometimes wise old women. Sometimes mysterious figures living beyond ordinary society. They test travelers before offering help. Kindness alone isn't enough. The heroine must demonstrate courage, patience, humility, and respect. Only then does assistance arrive. The gifts themselves also reflect northern landscapes. Instead of bright flowers and glittering gardens, magic comes wrapped in snow, ice, silver, moonlight, northern lights dancing across frozen skies. The dresses shimmer like fresh snowfall beneath the full moon. Jewels resemble frozen stars. Shoes sparkle like crystal ice resting on untouched lakes. Beauty in Scandinavia isn't soft. It's sharp, cold, almost dangerous. That aesthetic mirrors Norse mythology itself. The old gods rarely granted blessings without demanding sacrifice. Odin surrendered one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. Tyr sacrificed his hand. Even the gods paid prices for knowledge and power. The Cinderella tradition inherited that same worldview. Transformation wasn't a gift. It was earned. Many Scandinavian tales also place extraordinary importance on work. The heroine isn't admired because she's beautiful. She's admired because she's capable. She survives harsh conditions. She works harder than anyone else. She remains compassionate despite suffering. Strength becomes more attractive than perfection. That's a distinctly northern idea. In lands where survival depended upon cooperation, character mattered more than appearance. Another fascinating feature appears throughout Norse storytelling. The natural world watches. Animals observe. Mountains remember. Forests seem almost alive, like the birds of Grimm's Germany. Nature itself participates in justice. The world isn't passive. It notices human behavior, rewards integrity, punishes cruelty, sometimes without human involvement at all. Even royalty appears differently in Scandinavian stories. Kings aren't simply wealthy rulers. They're expected to protect their people from famine, war, and winter itself. A good queen isn't merely beautiful. She's wise enough to help a kingdom survive. Marriage becomes partnership, not fantasy. The prince often spends just as much time evaluating character as appearance. Beauty may attract attention, but endurance earns respect. Perhaps the most striking difference between Scandinavian variants and later fairy tales is their emotional restraint. Characters rarely deliver dramatic speeches. They simply endure. Grief remains quiet, love remains quiet, heroism remains quiet. The audience understands emotion through action, not words. That storytelling style reflects the harsh environment itself. When survival occupies every waking hour, there isn't much energy left for theatrical displays. By the end of these northern tales, Cinderella doesn't merely become queen. She becomes someone capable of ruling alongside winter itself. Someone who has already survived the hardest season life could offer. Someone who understands loss, responsibility, sacrifice, and resilience. Those qualities mattered far more than elegant gowns or jeweled crowns. In many ways, Scandinavian Cinderella asks a completely different question than Perrault's version. Not, can kindness be rewarded? But, can strength survive suffering? It's a subtle difference, yet it changes everything. Because once you've survived winter, very little else can frighten you. As Europe continued to evolve, another version of Cinderella emerged across the English countryside. One where magic slowly faded into the background. And intelligence, observation, and social strategy became the greatest supernatural powers of all. The English social contract, British variants, and class warfare. If the Scandinavian stories taught that survival required endurance, the English versions taught something entirely different. Survival required performance. By the late Middle Ages, England had become one of the most rigidly structured societies in Europe. Everyone knew their place. Kings ruled. Lords governed. Knights fought. Merchants traded. Farmers worked. Servants obeyed. At least, that was the ideal. Reality was much messier. Wars. Plague. Economic upheaval. And political instability constantly disrupted the social order. People rose. People fell. Families gained fortunes and lost them almost overnight. In that world, Cinderella became more than a fairy tale. She became a fantasy of social mobility. Unlike many continental versions, several English variants reduce the role of magic considerably. Instead of relying entirely on supernatural intervention, the heroine succeeds because she understands people better than they understand themselves. She watches. She listens. She learns. While everyone else underestimates her, she's quietly studying the rules. That idea fits remarkably well within English history. For centuries, advancement often depended less on brute strength than on education. Speech, etiquette, reputation, and knowing exactly how to behave in front of the right people. The English Cinderella masters all of them. She learns without teachers. She observes without being noticed. She transforms herself long before anyone gives her a beautiful dress. One of the best-known English variants is Catskin, a story collected centuries after it had circulated through oral tradition. Its beginning is startling. After his wife dies, a king becomes obsessed with marrying someone identical to her. The only person who matches her beauty is his own daughter. Horrified, the princess delays the marriage by demanding impossible gifts. Magnificent dresses. Extraordinary treasures. Finally, a cloak made from the skins of countless cats. Believing the disguise will destroy her beauty forever, she escapes the kingdom wearing the filthy cloak. She hides among servants, works in kitchens, sleeps beside ashes. Sound familiar? The details have changed, but the structure remains unmistakably Cinderella. The disguise protects her. The ashes conceal her. Her true identity remains hidden until the proper moment. Unlike Perrault's Cinderella, however, Catskin's greatest weapon isn't magic. It's intelligence. She knows exactly when to reveal herself, and exactly when to disappear again. English storytellers seemed fascinated by disguise. Again and again, heroes survive because powerful people fail to recognize those beneath them. Kings mistake servants for nobility. Nobles mistake intelligence for weakness. The poor observe everything. The rich observe almost nothing. That inversion appears repeatedly throughout English folklore. Power often blinds itself. Another fascinating difference appears in the role of work. French Cinderella becomes admirable because she's patient. German Cinderella because she's virtuous. The English heroine becomes admirable because she's competent. She cooks. She cleans. She manages households. She solves problems. Even while disguised as a servant, she quietly demonstrates the skills required to govern. To English audiences, that mattered. Running an estate required intelligence, organization, diplomacy, financial discipline. A future queen couldn't simply look beautiful. She had to be capable. The prince's search, therefore, becomes something more than romance. He's looking for someone who understands responsibility, someone who can navigate politics, someone who can command respect from nobles without losing the trust of ordinary people. Beauty might attract his attention. Competence earns his admiration. Even the magical clothing serves a different purpose. Rather than creating a completely new identity, it simply reveals the one already hidden beneath the ashes. The transformation isn't false. It's recognition. Perhaps that's why these English versions feel surprisingly modern. They're less interested in miracles and more interested in opportunity. The heroine succeeds because preparation meets circumstance. She spent years developing qualities no one bothered to notice. Then one opportunity changed everything. History itself often works exactly that way. Great leaders, inventors, artists, and revolutionaries usually appear to emerge overnight. In reality, they spent years preparing while nobody was paying attention. The English Cinderella reflects that truth beautifully. Transformation isn't instantaneous. It begins long before anyone notices. The old saying that luck favors the prepared could almost have been written for these stories. When the prince finally recognizes the heroine, he isn't discovering someone new. He's finally seeing the person who had been standing in front of him all along. That idea gives the English Cinderella remarkable emotional depth. She doesn't become extraordinary. She always was. Society simply failed to recognize it. In many ways, that's one of the most optimistic versions in all of European folklore. It suggests that dignity, character, and intelligence survive beneath poverty. That greatness can wear ordinary clothes, and that true worth eventually reveals itself. No matter how effectively the world tries to bury it beneath ashes. But nowhere in Europe did questions of identity become more complicated than they did in medieval Spain. There, Cinderella would become a story not only about transformation, but about honor, faith, and the price of reputation in a society where appearances could determine life or death. The Spanish Passion, Iberian variants, and the economy of honor. By the time the Cinderella story reached the Iberian Peninsula, Europe had become a crossroads of civilizations. For centuries, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived, traded, argued, fought, and influenced one another across what is now Spain and Portugal. The result was one of the richest cultural landscapes in medieval Europe. Architecture, science, medicine, philosophy, music, literature. Everything blended together. And so did the fairy tales. The Spanish Cinderella, known as La Cenicienta, became something very different from its northern cousins. It wasn't simply a story about escaping poverty. It became a story about honor. To understand medieval Spain, you first have to understand that honor wasn't merely personal pride. It was social currency. Your family's reputation determined who would trust you, who would marry you, who would trade with you, and sometimes, whether you lived or died. Lose your honor. And recovering it could take generations. That reality shaped Spanish folklore. The heroine's greatest challenge wasn't simply surviving her step-family. It was protecting her dignity while everyone around her tried to destroy it. Unlike later romantic versions, Spanish storytellers often emphasize discipline over destiny. The future queen isn't chosen because she's lucky. She's chosen because she possesses qualities that cannot be purchased. Patience, humility, self-control, wisdom. The stepmother understands this. Her attacks aren't always physical. They're psychological. She attempts to humiliate Cinderella publicly. To convince neighbors she is lazy, worthless, embarrassing. If reputation defines the future, destroying someone's reputation becomes a weapon. That idea would have resonated deeply throughout medieval Spain. Families constantly worried about public perception. Every action reflected upon the entire household. Marriage negotiations depended upon appearances. Political alliances depended upon trust. Honor became everything. Interestingly, Spanish variants frequently reduce spectacular displays of magic. Instead, transformation unfolds gradually. The heroine earns knowledge, learns etiquette, develops confidence, builds character. The beautiful dress becomes the final expression of work already completed internally. In other words, she becomes a queen before anyone places a crown on her head. The clothing merely allows everyone else to see it. Some Iberian traditions also reveal unmistakable influences from Islamic storytelling. Purification, discipline, preparation, repeated testing before reward. These themes appear throughout medieval Spanish literature. Transformation isn't sudden. It's cultivated. The heroine becomes worthy through perseverance rather than instant miracles. Another fascinating detail appears throughout Spanish versions. Clothing carries enormous symbolic importance. Every fabric, every jewel, every color communicates status, education, family, faith, political loyalty. People reading medieval audiences often understood these visual codes immediately. A dress wasn't simply beautiful. It announced exactly who someone claimed to be. That makes Cinderella's appearance at court especially significant. She's not merely wearing expensive clothing. She's speaking an entirely different social language. Without saying a word, she communicates refinement, education, confidence, authority, everything expected of future royalty. The prince notices, but not simply because she's attractive. He notices because she moves like someone born to command respect. That distinction matters. Beauty fades. Character reveals itself through behavior. Spanish storytellers return to this lesson repeatedly. The stepsisters, meanwhile, focus almost entirely on appearances. They imitate elegance. They imitate refinement. They imitate nobility. But imitation isn't authenticity. Eventually, the performance collapses. The contrast becomes obvious. One woman wears fine clothing. The other embodies dignity. Only one can become queen. Another remarkable feature of Spanish Cinderella traditions is forgiveness. Like Perrault's version, revenge often takes a back seat to mercy. But here, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's evidence of complete self-mastery. The heroine has already won. She no longer needs to humiliate those who once humiliated her. True authority, the story suggests, belongs to people who no longer require vengeance to prove their strength. That idea reflects centuries of religious and philosophical thought across medieval Spain. Power without discipline becomes tyranny. Power guided by wisdom becomes justice. By the conclusion of these stories, Cinderella has accomplished something far greater than escaping a cruel household. She has restored her family's honor, earned the respect of a kingdom, and demonstrated that genuine nobility cannot be inherited, purchased, or stolen. It must be lived. The Spanish Cinderella reminds us that identity isn't created by crowns or castles. It's created by choices, by integrity, by the ability to remain yourself when the world offers every reason to become someone else. It's one of the most hopeful interpretations in all of European folklore, because it suggests that true greatness doesn't begin when others recognize you. It begins long before they ever notice. But farther east, beyond the kingdoms of Western Europe, past the Carpathian Mountains, deep inside forests where ancient spirits still whispered through towering trees, another Cinderella waited. One who wouldn't find a fairy godmother or a royal court. She would find something far older, a hut standing on enormous chicken legs, and the terrifying woman who lived inside it. Her name was Baba Yaga. The Eastern European wilderness, Slavic variants, and the Baba Yaga tradition. If the forests of Germany were dark, the forests of Eastern Europe were alive. For centuries, vast woodlands stretched across modern-day Russia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Balkans. Entire villages disappeared beneath towering pines. Travelers vanished without explanation. Wolves hunted the roads. Winter swallowed entire landscapes. To the people who lived there, the forest wasn't simply part of nature. It was another world. A place where the ordinary rules of life no longer applied. And somewhere deep within those endless woods, according to Slavic folklore, lived one of mythology's most unforgettable figures, Baba Yaga. Unlike the gentle fairy godmothers of France or the protective spirits of Ireland, Baba Yaga couldn't be placed into simple categories. She wasn't good. She wasn't evil. She simply existed. Ancient. Powerful. Completely indifferent to human expectations. Sometimes she helped. Sometimes she destroyed. Often, she did both. Her home reflected her nature. A small wooden hut standing on enormous chicken legs. It turned. It moved. It obeyed commands. Visitors couldn't simply walk inside. They first had to know the proper words, the proper respect, the proper ritual. Already we can see something very different from later fairy tales. Magic isn't convenient. Magic demands knowledge. The Slavic Cinderella enters this forest not because she wants adventure, but because she has no other choice. A cruel stepmother frequently sends her on impossible errands. Fetch impossible objects. Complete impossible tasks. Travel into places from which no one returns. The goal isn't success. It's death. The stepmother expects the forest itself to finish the job. Instead, the heroine survives, not through strength, but through wisdom. One of Baba Yaga's most famous characteristics is that she constantly tests visitors. She assigns impossible work. Separate poppy seeds from dirt. Clean an entire house overnight. Prepare impossible meals. Complete tasks before sunrise. Anyone arrogant, impatient, or dishonest usually dies. The Cinderella figure succeeds because she treats everyone with respect. The old woman, the animals, the servants, even the strange talking objects inside the hut. Nothing is beneath her notice. Nothing is beneath her kindness. That becomes the real test. Throughout Slavic folklore, small acts of compassion often determine survival. Offer food to a hungry animal. It may save your life later. Help an old stranger. They may reveal themselves as supernatural. Ignore someone in need, and disaster soon follows. Unlike many Western European stories, these tales suggest that greatness isn't measured by status. It's measured by character when no one is watching. Eventually, Baba Yaga rewards the heroine. Not because she's innocent. Not because she's beautiful. Because she has demonstrated judgment, patience, discipline, and courage. The gifts she receives vary from story to story. Sometimes magical clothing. Sometimes enchanted objects. Sometimes impossible knowledge. Sometimes simply safe passage home. Whatever the reward, it reflects something important. Transformation begins inside the forest, not inside the palace. The forest itself functions almost like a living classroom. Every challenge strips away fear. Every success builds wisdom. By the time Cinderella leaves, she isn't the same person who entered. In many Slavic traditions, the prince almost becomes secondary. The real victory has already happened. The heroine survived Baba Yaga. Compared to that, royal court politics seem easy. Another fascinating feature appears throughout Eastern European folklore. Nature constantly observes human behavior. Trees remember. Rivers judge. Animals choose sides. Fire itself seems alive. Nothing exists merely as scenery. Everything participates in the story. This worldview reflects ancient Slavic spirituality, where the natural world possessed consciousness and deserved respect. Mistreat nature. Nature eventually answers. Respect it. And the world may quietly help you survive. Even Baba Yaga herself reflects this balance. She punishes greed, arrogance, cruelty, laziness. But she frequently rewards humility, preparation, hard work, and intelligence. She becomes less a villain and more a force of nature, like winter, like fire, like the sea, dangerous, but fair in her own mysterious way. Perhaps that's why she continues fascinating audiences centuries later. She's unpredictable, impossible to control, entirely unconcerned with human ideas of justice. She follows older laws that existed long before kingdoms, long before churches, perhaps long before written history itself. The Slavic Cinderella reminds us that real transformation often happens far away from comfort. It happens in uncertainty, in fear, in isolation, inside forests where nothing feels familiar. Only after surviving those experiences does the heroine become capable of ruling. The palace doesn't transform her. The wilderness does. It's one of the oldest lessons preserved in European folklore. You don't discover who you are until everything familiar has been taken away. As our journey across Europe comes to an end, one question remains. Why did nearly every culture preserve this story? Why did kingdoms that spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and fought one another for centuries continue telling remarkably similar tales? The answer may reveal why Cinderella remains one of humanity's most powerful stories, even today. Why Cinderella never really changed. After traveling through prehistoric Europe, Italy, France, Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia, England, Spain, and Eastern Europe, one question remains. How did one story survive for more than 1,000 years? Empires collapsed. Languages changed. Religions spread. Borders moved. Kings rose. Kingdoms disappeared. Yet Cinderella endured. Not because every culture copied one another, but because every culture recognized something profoundly human inside the story. Strip away the castles, the gowns, the princes, the fairy godmothers, and something remarkably familiar remains. A person born into hardship, someone underestimated, someone ignored, someone forced to survive circumstances they never chose, someone who eventually transforms into something the people around them never believed possible. That story belongs to everyone. Perhaps that's why every civilization made Cinderella its own. The French emphasized elegance. The Germans emphasized justice. The Irish emphasized supernatural bargains. The Scandinavians celebrated endurance. The English admired intelligence. The Spanish valued honor. The Slavic world respected wisdom earned through hardship. Different cultures, different values, the same journey. But something else remained remarkably consistent. Transformation always required sacrifice. Modern audiences often focus on the reward, the palace, the wedding, the crown. Ancient storytellers focused on the cost, the loneliness, the grief, the humiliation, the years spent believing life would never improve. They understood something psychology would later spend centuries trying to explain. People rarely become stronger without suffering. That doesn't mean suffering is good. It means suffering changes people, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. Cinderella survives because she refuses to allow cruelty to define who she becomes. That may be the story's greatest lesson, not magic, not romance, resilience. Another fascinating pattern appears throughout nearly every version: recognition. The prince doesn't create Cinderella, he discovers her. The transformation has already happened, the palace simply reveals it. That's a powerful idea. Many people spend years believing no one notices them, their work, their kindness, their intelligence, their character. Cinderella suggests something different. Sometimes recognition arrives long after transformation has already taken place. History is filled with examples: artists ignored during their lifetimes, scientists dismissed by their peers, inventors mocked before changing the world, ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things after years of being overlooked. The fairy tale speaks directly to that experience. It reminds us that value exists whether the world recognizes it or not. Another reason the story survives may be far simpler. Every generation has its stepmother. Not always a person. Sometimes poverty, sometimes illness, sometimes war, sometimes grief, sometimes fear, sometimes self-doubt. Every generation has its ashes. Every generation has obstacles that seem impossible. And every generation hopes transformation is still possible. That's why Cinderella never disappeared. She simply changed clothes. The details evolved. The emotional truth remained. Modern psychology also offers fascinating insight. Many scholars interpret Cinderella as a story of identity formation. The ashes represent emotional collapse. The transformation represents psychological growth. The palace symbolizes integration into adulthood. Whether those interpretations were intended by ancient storytellers almost doesn't matter. Stories often reveal truths their creators never consciously recognized. Perhaps that's why they continue speaking to us centuries later. They're mirrors. Every generation sees itself inside them. The medieval peasant saw hope. The Renaissance courtier saw ambition. The Victorian child saw morality. Modern audiences often see empowerment. Each interpretation reveals as much about the listener as the story itself. That may explain why debates about Cinderella never end. Was she passive? Was she courageous? Was she rescued? Or did she rescue herself? The answer depends largely on which version you're reading. And perhaps that's exactly the point. There has never been one Cinderella. There have always been hundreds. Hundreds of women. Hundreds of storytellers. Hundreds of cultures. All wrestling with the same timeless question: can someone truly become someone else? The oldest versions answer carefully: yes. But not without paying the price. The newest versions often answer differently: yes. Because you already possessed that strength all along. Maybe both are true. Transformation always costs something. But the strength to survive it may have been inside the heroine from the very beginning. That idea has carried Cinderella across continents, across centuries, across languages, and into our own time. Not because she wore a beautiful dress, but because she reminded generations of ordinary people that even in the darkest moments, life can still change. And perhaps that is the most magical part of the story. We've spent this journey peeling back layer after layer of one of the world's most famous stories. What began as a fairy tale ended as something far more complicated. A cultural time capsule, a survival manual, a psychological portrait, a reflection of the societies that created it. Whether the setting was a French palace, a German village, an Irish hillside, a Scandinavian forest, a Spanish court, or a Slavic wilderness, the message remained remarkably consistent. Transformation changes everything. Not simply your circumstances, not simply your appearance. It changes who you are. Perhaps that's why Cinderella has survived, while thousands of other medieval stories quietly disappeared. Every generation discovers itself inside the tale. Sometimes we're the servant. Sometimes we're the stepsister. Sometimes we're the prince searching for answers. Sometimes we're simply trying to survive another day beneath the ashes, hoping tomorrow looks different than today. The details have changed over the centuries. Disney gave us songs. Hollywood gave us romance. Modern audiences gave us empowerment. But beneath every adaptation, the ancient story still breathes. It still whispers the same uncomfortable truth. Growth demands sacrifice. Power requires responsibility. May have been inside the heroine from the very beginning. That idea has carried Cinderella across continents, across centuries, across languages, and into our own time. Not because she wore a beautiful dress, but because she reminded generations of ordinary people that even in the darkest moments, life can still change. And perhaps that is the most magical part of the story. That belief has carried Cinderella through centuries. And perhaps it's still carrying us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten origins of one of history's most enduring legends. Until next time, keep asking questions. Keep digging beneath the surface. And remember, the stories we think we know usually hide the biggest secrets. And don't trust every fairy tale that promises a happily ever after. If you enjoyed today's documentary and you appreciate deep dives that go beyond the Hollywood version of history, you're in the right place. Here at Pizzaverse Studios, we don't just tell stories. We dig through the history. We compare the sources. We separate folklore from fact. And sometimes, we discover the truth is far stranger than the legend. If that's your kind of content, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Every week we explore organized crime, forgotten history, fairy tales, psychology, ancient mysteries, historical true crime, and the stories that shaped the world we live in today. Leave me a comment below. Which Cinderella variant shocked you the most? Did Basile's murderous heroine surprise you? Did the brothers Grimm's bloody justice catch you off guard? Or did Baba Yaga convince you that maybe wandering into the woods isn't such a great idea after all? I read as many comments as I possibly can, and your suggestions often become future documentaries. If you'd like to help support the channel, share this documentary with someone who thinks Cinderella has always been nothing more than a harmless bedtime story. Trust me, they're in for one hell of a surprise. From all of us here at Pizzaverse Studios, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, where we'll uncover another story hiding beneath the surface of history.
In dreams you will lose your heartache. Whatever you wish for, you keep. Have faith in your dreams, and someday your rainbow will come smiling through. No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true.
What happens when a man lives by one code and survives by another? He rose through the ranks of one of New York's most notorious organized crime families. He admitted to violent crimes. He cooperated with the federal government. His testimony helped shape major mafia prosecutions. And decades later, the controversy never stopped. This isn't another mob story. This isn't another YouTube interview. This is an examination of power, loyalty, self-preservation, and the psychology behind choices that changed countless lives. Using court records, public testimony, historical sources, and documented evidence, Pizzaverse Studios takes an unflinching look at one of the most controversial cooperators in modern organized crime history. No Hollywood mythology. No romanticizing the mafia. No fairy tales about the life. Just the record. The decisions, the consequences, and the uncomfortable questions that still divide investigators, former mobsters, and the public. Was it justice? Was it survival? Or was it something far more complicated? You'll decide. This isn't about glorifying organized crime. It's about exposing what it leaves behind. Broken families, prison cells, victims, and lives that can never be put back together. This is Analyzing Evil. Dominic Cicale. Cooperation, Controversy, and the Cost of Survival. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. Coming soon. Subscribe now. Because the truth doesn't need special effects. It just needs the courage to be examined.
Yeah. Look. Pockets looking cakey like these bummy bitches. Makeup, it's room service, bitch. The game requested that it get waked up. See, all I see is paper, like my secretary stapler. So if this was your job, then I'm thinking you're about to get a pay cut. This is my lane. So fuck road rage, fuck your anger. I swear they wanna cuff this pretty young thing like us. They love us cause I'm cute and I be killing games since back when it was Sega. I be reppin'. what I'm made of. Cause we ain't the same and they don't want you from the waist up. You the cookie cutter type and they call me the baker. And all I see is numbers, numbers, numbers like a kill pager. I kill them and collect them, watch me murder glass cases. Swear you bout to feel where the fuck I'm coming from like a taser. Cause if she fuck with me, then not even the captain finna save her. These bitches thinking they beefing, fuck around and get fed later.
Looking, I don't see no difference. Cookie, 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 all these cookie cutter bitches. Fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches. Oh, cookie cutter bitches. And I be looking, I don't see no difference. Cookie, 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 all these cookie cutter bitches. Fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches. Oh, cookie cutter bitches.
Look, you were just a small fry, but I turn you to mashed potato. I'm here to bring the flavor, just like a turkey baster. I could be the finisher that'll make you meet your maker. See, if you still sleeping, I'm awake and baking, shake ya. See, I be reppin' real women, so bitches seeming faker. Now they be tripping on me, but like MGK say, lace up, cause my style is permanent, and these bitches dry eraser. And all you April fools, I'll kill you off before May come. Yeah, I know guerrilla warfare if you wanna ape up. All these chicks be thinking that they beast, well watch me tame 'em. Greetings earthlings, assalamu alaikum. Cause I'm out of this world, this illegal alien is way up. I'm ahead of my time, but I like competing, so I've been waiting. Then I turn the lights on these roach bitches and I rate 'em. Bitches owe me royalties for jacking lyrics, so pay up. Cause most of you bitches in rap been knowing about me, but you wishing that I never came up.
Looking, I don't see no difference. Cookie, 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 all these cookie cutter bitches. Fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches. Oh, cookie cutter bitches. And I be looking, I don't see no difference. Cookie, 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 all these cookie cutter bitches. Fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches, fuck these bitches. Oh, cookie cutter bitches.
Look, man, I just keep looking around and all these bitches look so fucking